In the quiet town of Point Pleasant, nestled by the Ohio River, whispers of strange occurrences began to ripple through the streets. It started with fleeting shadows, brief glimpses of something not quite human, but it was soon impossible to ignore. The townspeople spoke of a creature, massive, dark, and otherworldly, with glowing red eyes that cut through the fog. They called it Mothman. One chilly November evening, John Klein, a journalist with a taste for the strange, was driving through the back roads toward the town with his wife, Mary. The couple, after a long day of house hunting, found themselves speeding through desolate fields as night closed in. The headlights of their car illuminated the winding road ahead when suddenly something darted in front of them. John swerved, narrowly avoiding it, and the car skidded to a halt. Both shaken, they looked around but saw nothing. That is until Mary gasped. Across the field, perched on an abandoned silo, a figure stood motionless. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with enormous wings folded behind it. Its glowing red eyes burned in the distance, locking onto their car with an unblinking stare. John's heart raced as he turned to his wife, only to find her clutching her temples in pain. Without warning, Mary let out a sharp scream as if something unseen had invaded her mind. 2 days later, Mary fell mysteriously ill. Doctors were baffled, as there was no apparent cause. She passed away within the month, leaving John devastated and with no answers. But there was something else, something terrifying. In her final moments, Mary spoke of a man, or rather, a creature, that had visited her in her dreams. She described it in vivid detail. The same figure they had seen that night, with the piercing red eyes. Grief-stricken and haunted by his wife's final words, John couldn't let it go. He needed answers. As he delved deeper into Point Pleasant's history, he discovered that the creature had been seen by many, always before something terrible happened. It wasn't just an apparition, it was a warning. The sightings of Mothman became more frequent. Locals reported seeing the creature hovering above buildings, standing in the middle of roads, or even lurking in their backyards. But more disturbing were the dreams. People claimed that the Mothman spoke to them, not in words, but in visions of destruction, of bridges collapsing, of death. It wasn't long before John began having these dreams too, dreams of catastrophe. One night, John awoke in a cold sweat, the image of a crumbling bridge fresh in his mind. He knew the bridge. It was the silver bridge that connected Point Pleasant to the other side of the river. The vision was so vivid, the screams so real, that he felt compelled to act. Something was going to happen, and soon. Desperate, John tried to warn the authorities, but they brushed him off, calling him paranoid and grief-stricken. His warnings fell on deaf ears, even as more and more people reported seeing Mothman, its glowing eyes haunting the town like an omen. The creature seemed to be everywhere, a silent herald of doom. And then, on December 15th, 1967, it happened. The Silver Bridge, crowded with rush-hour traffic, collapsed into the icy waters below. 46 people lost their lives as cars and trucks plunged into the river. The town was thrown into chaos, and among the survivors, many spoke of having seen the Mothman on the bridge just before the collapse. John stood at the edge of the river, watching the rescue efforts, knowing that what had happened wasn't an accident. The visions, the sightings, it had all been leading to this. The Mothman wasn't just a creature of nightmares, it was a harbinger, a messenger of some unknown force, warning them of impending disaster. But why? And more importantly, why had no one listened? As the days passed, the sightings of the Mothman dwindled, and eventually it vanished altogether, leaving the town with its grief and unanswered questions. John, haunted by the tragedy, returned to his home, but his life would never be the same. The creature still appeared to him in dreams, not as a warning this time, but as a reminder. A reminder that some things are beyond human understanding, that there are forces at work in the world that defy explanation. Years later, John would write about the events in Point Pleasant, hoping to piece together the mystery that had consumed his life. But even as he put pen to paper, he knew that the truth would remain elusive. The Mothman had come and gone, leaving only destruction in its wake. And somewhere in the shadows it waits, watching, waiting, and perhaps, one day, returning. John Klein's life had become an echo of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. The collapse of the Silver Bridge was a scar not just on Point Pleasant, but on his very soul. Though years had passed since that terrible day, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Mothman was still watching him, lurking just out of sight in the corners of his mind. In his new home, far from the river that claimed so many lives, John thought he had left the nightmare behind. But the nightmares persisted. At first, they were fleeting. A glimpse of those glowing red eyes as he drifted off to sleep. Then they became more vivid. He would find himself standing on the edge of a cliff, or at the mouth of a tunnel, or in the middle of a crowded street, always staring at some looming disaster. Buildings would sway, roads would crumble, and the air would be filled with the deafening sound of rushing water, fire, or the screams of strangers. But it was always there, hovering on the edge of his vision, the Mothman, watching. One particularly cold night, as John sat by his desk, surrounded by papers filled with notes and half-written theories about the creature, the power flickered. The lamps dimmed, and a chill ran through the room. He froze, the air around him suddenly heavy. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned his head towards the window. There, perched on a tree just beyond the glass, were two glowing red eyes piercing the darkness. John's breath caught in his throat, but he couldn't move. The figure outside was motionless, its wings folded behind it, just like the first night he had seen it with Mary all those years ago. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as though time itself had stopped. And then, without warning, the Mothman unfurled its massive wings and disappeared into the night, leaving only the whisper of the wind in its wake. That's when the phone rang. John's hand trembled as he reached for the receiver, his heart pounding in his chest. He pressed it to his ear, expecting to hear static or some disembodied voice. But instead, there was a silence on the other end. Just as he was about to hang up, a distorted voice, low and slow, broke through the static. "It is not finished." The words sent a chill down his spine, and before he could respond, the line went dead. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and mounting dread. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind outside, made John feel like he was being watched. The dreams grew darker. He saw not just the Mothman now, but faces, human faces twisted in fear and anguish, staring at him, pleading for help. And always, in the background, the sound of something breaking. A bridge, a tower, a city, collapsing into ruin. It wasn't until he saw the news that the dreams finally made sense. Reports came in from all over the country, strange sightings, mysterious figures, whispers of disasters to come. A dam in the Midwest was showing signs of structural failure. A series of earthquakes along the West Coast. Tornadoes touching down in towns that hadn't seen them in decades. It was happening again. The Mothman had been a harbinger once, and now it was warning John again. But this time, it wasn't just one town in danger. The destruction was far larger, more terrifying. John tried reaching out to people, friends, former colleagues, even the police, but no one would listen. He had become the man no one believed, the man obsessed with monsters and prophecies, and yet the evidence was there, creeping closer with each passing day. The Mothman had shown him the future once, and it was showing him again. Only now, the stakes were unimaginably higher. One evening, in the midst of this chaos, John received an unexpected visitor. A woman, her face pale and eyes wide with fear, stood at his door. She introduced herself as Laura Bennett, a researcher who had been investigating paranormal phenomena. She had read about John's experiences in Point Pleasant and believed him. She had seen it too. Not the Mothman itself, but signs. Strange happenings, just like the ones that plagued Point Pleasant before the bridge collapsed. Laura had been tracking the creature for months, piecing together sightings and patterns. According to her research, the Mothman had been appearing in towns and cities all across the country, always before some kind of disaster. It was no longer confined to one place. And now, it was showing itself more frequently than ever. Together, John and Laura began to dig deeper. They followed leads, interviewed witnesses, and pieced together the puzzle. And with each new discovery, it became clear. The Mothman wasn't just a warning of physical destruction. It was a symbol, a harbinger of something far more sinister, something beyond human comprehension. Some believed it was tied to ancient prophecies, others thought it was a messenger from another realm. But one thing was certain, it was growing stronger, and its warnings more dire. In a final desperate attempt to stop what was coming, John and Laura decided to return to Point Pleasant, the place where it all began. They hoped to find some clue, some answer buried in the wreckage of the past. But as they arrived at the foot of the Silver Bridge Memorial, a heavy fog rolled in, cloaking the river in an eerie, unnatural silence. And then, through the mist, the figure appeared once more, tall, dark, and foreboding. The Mothman. Its red eyes glowed brighter than ever before, and its wings stretched out, casting a shadow over the land. It seemed to beckon them forward, leading them toward the river, toward the place where so many had lost their lives. But this time John wasn't afraid. He knew now that the Mothman wasn't a bringer of death, it was a warning. And whatever it was warning them about was far from over. As the creature hovered above the water, John realized with a sinking dread that perhaps the Mothman wasn't here to save anyone. Maybe it was just watching, waiting for the inevitable. The world was teetering on the edge of something catastrophic, something beyond even his darkest dreams. And all they could do was wait. The fog thickened, swallowing the landscape around John and Laura until they could barely see each other. The air felt oppressive, charged with an energy that made their skin tingle. The figure of the Mothman loomed ahead, unmoving, its wings spreading out like the night itself. John's voice trembled as he turned to Laura. "What does it want? Why now?" Laura stared at the glowing eyes, transfixed. "I don't know, but I think it's showing us what's coming. Something worse. This is just the beginning." A sharp crack echoed through the air, like the snap of a tree branch, and both of them flinched. The ground beneath them trembled as if the earth itself were awakening. The fog seemed to pulse in time with the vibrations, thickening like a living thing, suffocating, pressing down on them. And in the distance, barely audible, was a sound that chilled them both to the bone, the faint rush of water, distant but unmistakable, like a tidal wave approaching from far off. The sound stirred a memory in John, a vision from his recurring dreams. His eyes widened. "The dam? Laura, it's the dam. The one in the Midwest." Laura turned to him, her face pale with understanding. "You think it's going to collapse?" John nodded, his pulse racing. "The dreams. It was always water, flooding, destroying everything. And it's not just the dam, it's everywhere. The earthquakes, the storms, it's all connected." A deep rumble reverberated beneath their feet, growing stronger with each second. The Mothman hadn't moved. It still hovered, eyes glowing brighter, watching them intently. John felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't warning them about a single disaster. It was warning them about a chain of events, a global catastrophe that was about to unfold. "We need to warn them," John gasped, backing away from the figure. "We need to tell someone, anyone, before it's too late." But as he turned to leave, something strange happened. The Mothman's wings began to beat, slow and deliberate, stirring the fog around it. The sound wasn't like the flapping of a bird's wings. It was deeper, heavier, as if the air itself was being torn apart. And then, with an eerie grace, it lifted into the sky, disappearing into the fog without a sound. Laura's eyes darted around wildly. "John, it's gone. What do we do now?" John didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the river, his mind racing. The creature had shown them the future before, and he had failed to prevent the tragedy. But this time it felt different. The weight of impending doom pressed down on him. This was no longer just a small-town warning. The world was on the brink of something catastrophic, and the Mothman had made sure they knew. Without another word, they raced back to the car. John's hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, but they were soon speeding down the road, the fog curling around them like ghostly fingers. Hours passed in a blur as they reached out to authorities, trying desperately to get someone to believe them. They tried the police, government agencies, even reporters. But the responses were the same: skepticism, dismissal, and occasionally mockery. The warnings were falling on deaf ears again, just as they had before. Exhausted and defeated, John and Laura found themselves in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, surrounded by their scattered notes and maps. The news played on a small TV in the corner of the room, showing images of the dam John had dreamed about. Engineers were being interviewed, assuring the public that everything was under control, that there was no need for panic. But John knew better. He had seen this before. That night, as they both drifted into a restless sleep, John's dreams returned, more vivid than ever. This time, he wasn't just a spectator. He was standing on the dam itself, feeling the cold concrete beneath his feet. The sky above was dark, swirling with ominous clouds, and the water below churned violently. And there, standing on the edge of the dam, was the Mothman. Its red eyes glowed brighter than the storm clouds, watching him waiting. Suddenly, the sound of cracking concrete filled the air. John looked down in horror as a jagged crack snaked through the dam, spreading like a wound. The rumble of water grew louder, more menacing, and in an instant the structure gave way. A wall of water rushed toward him, unstoppable, consuming everything in its path. John jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. He shot a glance at Laura, who was sitting up in bed, eyes wide with terror. "I saw it too," she whispered. "It's happening." The next morning, the news was filled with reports. The dam had collapsed in the early hours of the morning, sending a massive flood tearing through towns and farmland, leaving devastation in its wake. Dozens were dead, hundreds missing. The very disaster John had feared. He sat in stunned silence, staring at the screen. Once again, the Mothman had shown him the future, and once again, he had been powerless to stop it. But this time, the realization was different. The disaster wasn't isolated. Reports were coming in from other parts of the country. A string of earthquakes had rocked the west coast, freak tornadoes had torn through the heartland, and an unprecedented storm system was forming off the eastern seaboard. It was all happening just as the Mothman had shown them. John stood, his legs unsteady. The world was unraveling, piece by piece, and the Mothman's warnings had gone unheeded for too long. Whatever force was behind the creature, whatever it was trying to communicate, humanity had failed to understand. Laura's voice broke the silence. "John, what do we do now?" He looked at her, eyes filled with both fear and resignation. "We wait." For the first time in his life, John understood the truth. The Mothman had never been there to stop the disaster. It was simply there to witness. And now so were they. The days that followed were a blur of chaos. News stations around the world could barely keep up with the growing list of calamities. Floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, and fires erupted in places that had never seen such devastation before. It was as if the earth itself was rebelling, tearing itself apart, piece by piece. John and Laura watched it all unfold, helpless. The nightmares didn't stop. If anything, they grew more intense. The Mothman appeared in every vision now, standing amidst the ruins, its red eyes unwavering, unfeeling. Each dream was worse than the last. Skyscrapers crumbling into the streets, entire cities sinking into the ocean, and faceless crowds running, screaming, but unable to escape the inevitable destruction. But the worst part, no matter where the visions took him, John always saw the creature, watching. One night, after a particularly brutal dream of a massive sinkhole swallowing an entire town, John awoke with a start. His chest heaved with panic, and the dark room felt suffocating. He stumbled out of bed, looking for something, anything, to make sense of the nightmare. But there was nothing, no explanation, no solution. Just doom. Laura found him sitting at the motel desk, staring blankly at a map. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of everything they'd seen, and the crushing reality that they were powerless to stop it. "John," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "we can't just sit here. We need to do something." He didn't look up. "Do what, Laura?" "We've tried everything. No one will listen." "They never do." "We can warn people. Maybe not the authorities, but someone. We can go to the places you've seen in your dreams. Tell them what's coming." John's hand trembled as he traced a line across the map. "And what if it's too late? What if no matter how hard we try, the Mothman isn't showing us these things to stop them, but just to make us witness it all?" Laura's grip tightened. "I refuse to believe that. There has to be a reason we're seeing this. There has to be a way to save someone." John finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. They were filled with a hollow kind of acceptance, the kind that comes after years of fighting an invisible enemy. "Maybe saving someone isn't the point, Laura. Maybe we were chosen just to know." Laura recoiled at the thought. No, there has to be more than that. We can't just be spectators to the end of the world." But deep down, John wasn't so sure anymore. He remembered Mary, her final words about the creature, her illness, her death. He thought about Point Pleasant, about the Silver Bridge, and the countless lives lost despite the warnings. The creature had never spoken, never directly intervened. It only observed, watched, and now it was showing them, him, what was coming next. 2 days later, the sinkhole from John's dream became a reality. A town in Pennsylvania vanished into the earth, just as he had seen it. The media scrambled for explanations: natural gas leaks, unstable bedrock. But John and Laura knew the truth. The visions had foretold it. And still, the world refused to listen. The pattern continued. Each disaster played out just as John had dreamed, as if the future had already been written and there was no escaping it. People were dying, and the Mothman, silent and monstrous, hovered above the carnage, watching it all unfold. One night, after a particularly violent dream of a storm leveling the East Coast, John awoke to a new sensation. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a feeling of finality. He sat up in bed, staring out the window at the darkened sky, knowing deep in his bones that something had shifted. He knew what was coming. "Laura," he whispered, shaking her gently awake. "It's time." She blinked at him, confused and bleary-eyed. "What do you mean?" "I saw it. The final vision. The last one." Her heart skipped a beat. "What did you see?" John swallowed hard. It wasn't just a town or a city, it was everything. Everything was collapsing. The earth, the sky, the seas. It's the end, Laura. There's no stopping it." Laura stared at him in horror, the weight of his words sinking in. "How much time do we have?" John closed his eyes. The image of the Mothman's unblinking red eyes still burned into his mind. Not much. A few days, maybe. They spent the next morning in a haze of panic and desperation. There was no use trying to warn the world. At this point, it was far too late. Instead, they focused on preparing themselves, accepting the inevitable. It was a cruel fate, knowing the end was near and being powerless to stop it. That evening, as the sky turned a strange, unnatural shade of crimson, the air became heavy with a sense of finality. The birds had gone silent. The wind had stilled. The world itself seemed to be holding its breath. John and Laura stood on a hill overlooking the town, watching the horizon with a quiet sense of dread. They knew it wouldn't be long now. The visions had been clear. And sure enough, as the last light of day faded into darkness, the ground beneath them began to tremble. And there, silhouetted against the blood-red sky, the Mothman appeared. It hovered above them, its wings spread wide, its glowing eyes fixated on the horizon. The rumbling grew louder, the earth buckling and groaning beneath their feet. The creature didn't move, didn't react. It simply watched. John took a deep breath, his voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. "It's here." Laura's eyes were wide with terror, but she didn't scream. She simply grasped John's hand, squeezing it tightly, as the world around them began to fall apart. Buildings in the distance crumbled to dust, the earth split open in jagged lines, and the sky above twisted into a violent storm of fire and lightning. And still the Mothman remained. The end was inevitable now. John could feel it in his bones, in his very soul. He turned to Laura, his eyes filled with sorrow and resignation. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." But there was no time for apologies. The world was ending, and they had been chosen to bear witness. As the ground beneath them gave way and the sky above consumed them, John's final thought was of the Mothman and the terrible truth it had shown him. Some things cannot be stopped. Some things must simply be seen. And in that final, shattering moment, as the world crumbled into darkness, the Mothman's eyes remained, watching. Always watching. The darkness swallowed everything, a crushing silence following the destruction. Time seemed to stop as the world slipped away, and for a moment, John felt weightless, suspended in the void between life and death, between the end and whatever came after. But then, a flicker of something stirred in the blackness, faint at first, but growing brighter. Red. Pulsing. Unmistakable. The glowing eyes of the Mothman. John wasn't dead. Not yet. The world around him was gone, erased, obliterated, but somehow in this void he remained. He tried to move, to find some sense of where he was, but his body felt detached, like he was drifting in a vast, endless space. And then he heard it. A voice, soft at first, but clear. It wasn't Laura's voice or any human voice he had ever heard. It was cold, distant, yet undeniably real. "You have seen." John's heart pounded in his chest, though he couldn't feel his body. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He strained to locate the source, but there was only the darkness and those burning red eyes. "Who are you?" John's voice trembled, his question more a thought than spoken words. I am what you have feared. I am what you have sought. The witness. The end. The Mothman's eyes glowed brighter, illuminating the void, revealing glimpses of a fractured reality around John. For fleeting moments he saw flashes, memories of the disasters, of the lives lost, of the moments leading up to this final cataclysm. And then he saw Laura. She was there, somewhere in the distance, though she too seemed suspended, frozen in the same in-between place. He reached out for her, but his hand passed through the void like smoke. You are not meant to follow her. You are not meant to escape. John's mind raced. What does that mean? Why am I here? Why did you show me all of this? Why did you let this happen? The voice seemed to rumble with ancient knowledge, as if it had existed long before humanity, long before time itself. You misunderstand. The Mothman's presence seemed to grow, its wings spreading wide across the void. It was never a question of letting. It was always inevitable. You were not chosen to stop it. You were chosen to witness. Witness what? John's voice cracked with desperation. The end of everything. Why? Why me? The red eyes burned through him, penetrating his very soul. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, before the voice returned, colder than before. Because someone must, and that someone is you. The truth hit John like a punch to the chest. He wasn't special. He wasn't destined to save the world or stop the disasters. He was a spectator, a passive observer of humanity's demise. The Mothman, whatever it was, wasn't a savior or a destroyer. It was something far worse. It was the eternal watcher, the one who bore witness to the collapse of worlds, over and over again. John's voice shook with rage and sorrow. There must have been a way. We could have stopped it if we had known sooner. The red eyes blinked once, and the void trembled. There was no stopping what was set in motion, long before you. Long before your kind. You were given visions, yes, but the visions were not gifts. They were not warnings. They were reminders. John's heart sank. Reminders of what? That nothing lasts. That all things end. The same way they have before. The same way they will again. John couldn't accept it. The enormity of it, the sheer, hopeless finality. He had spent so much time believing that the visions were a chance to prevent disaster, that the Mothman was a harbinger of warning, a chance to save what was left. But now he realized the truth. The creature didn't care about saving anyone. It didn't care about humanity at all. It was simply there to watch the inevitable destruction unfold. The void seemed to pulse around him, distorting and reshaping. John felt himself being pulled deeper into the darkness, further away from Laura, from the world he had known. The Mothman's glowing eyes began to fade, but its voice lingered, cold and final. You are part of the cycle now, John Klein. You have witnessed the end, and you will witness it again. And again. No, John whispered, though he knew it was useless. Please no. But the voice was merciless, unrelenting. All ends, and so it begins once more. With that, the darkness consumed him completely. John awoke with a start, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. The world around him was familiar, too familiar. He was in his car, driving down a dark road. Next to him, Mary sat, smiling, flipping through a brochure for a new house. The soft hum of the engine, the radio playing faintly, the winding road illuminated by the headlights. It was the night it all began. John's hands clenched the steering wheel, trembling. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How was he here? Was it a dream? A nightmare? John, you okay? Mary's voice was soft, gentle, just as he remembered. But before he could respond, before he could make sense of it all, a shadow darted across the road. John's heart leaped into his throat, and he slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. Mary gasped, gripping the armrest. What was that? John's breath caught in his throat. He knew what it was. His eyes darted to the side of the road, where it stood just as before. Tall, dark, wings folded behind it, and those terrible, glowing red eyes. The Mothman. The cycle had begun again. The world was doomed to repeat its fate, over and over, with John trapped inside it, forever watching the end, unable to stop it. And as the creature stared back at him, John realized with a sinking horror that this was his eternity. To witness, to remember, to suffer. The Mothman spread its wings and vanished into the night, leaving John alone in the silence of the road, knowing all too well that the nightmare had only just begun. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of time, the Mothman watched, waiting for the world to fall apart once more. John sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, staring into the empty darkness where the Mothman had vanished. The world outside was silent, but inside, his mind was a storm of disbelief and terror. He turned to Mary, his heart pounding, expecting to see her face, her confused, worried expression, as it had been that fateful night. But she was already gone. The seat beside him was empty, and the car's engine hummed softly in the still night. The road stretched ahead, the same endless stretch of asphalt he'd driven countless times in his memories. He glanced at his hands on the wheel, willing himself to wake up from this nightmare, but the reality pressed in around him, heavy and suffocating. He was trapped. The headlights flickered once, twice, then dimmed, plunging the road into near total darkness. And yet, in that deep void, John felt a familiar presence. Not just the Mothman, but something larger, more pervasive, the weight of time folding in on itself, reality unraveling in ways he couldn't comprehend. There was no escaping this. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Static hissed through the speakers, followed by distorted voices, words bending and warping as if coming from another dimension. "You have seen." John's heart leaped into his throat. The voice, it was the same cold, detached presence he'd heard in the void. The same voice of the Mothman, or whatever force existed behind those red, glowing eyes. It seemed to be everywhere, filling the air with its resonance, pressing in on his skull like invisible hands. "It will begin again. You cannot stop it." John slammed his hand on the dashboard, a surge of frustration rising in his chest. "Why?" he shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "Why show me if I can't change anything? Why trap me here?" The radio hissed and crackled, the voice responding with calm indifference. "You are not here to change. You are here to know." John's breath hitched, his mind reeling. What does that even mean? He muttered under his breath, though deep down he knew. He wasn't meant to save anyone. The Mothman had never been a beacon of hope or warning. It was an instrument of fate, a cold observer of the inevitable, and John was its unwilling companion in this endless loop. Suddenly, the road ahead was bathed in light, bright, unnatural light that cut through the darkness like a blade. John blinked against the intensity, his heart racing as he realized what was coming. The same moment, replaying again. The figure appeared in the center of the road, just as it had that night so long ago. Tall and looming, its wings draped behind it like the cloak of death itself. The Mothman stood in the middle of the road, its red eyes glowing like burning embers, watching him. John felt the car surge forward on its own, the engine roaring louder, pushing him toward the creature. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't steer away. He was trapped in this moment, hurtling toward disaster, powerless to stop it. As the car approached, the Mothman spread its wings wide, and for a split second, John saw something in its eyes, not just the cold detachment of an observer, but something deeper, something ancient. It wasn't malevolent, not in the way a human might understand. It was simply there. A force beyond reason, beyond time, existing only to watch. The car hit the figure, but instead of the impact John braced for, there was nothing. No crash, no sound. The Mothman vanished as the car passed through the space where it had stood, leaving only the ghostly afterimage of those terrible red eyes in John's mind. And then everything went black. John awoke again, the same sensation of weightlessness pulling him from unconsciousness. This time, he found himself standing in a vast open field. The sky above him was a bruised shade of purple, swirling with storm clouds that seemed to pulse with energy. The air smelled of ozone and earth, as if a storm was about to break. He turned in a slow circle, disoriented. The landscape stretched out endlessly in all directions, barren and silent. And there, on the horizon, he saw it. The Mothman, perched atop a crumbling hill, its wings folded, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. John knew instinctively that he was no longer in the world he once knew. This place was different. A liminal space, a fragment of something between worlds. The end of one reality and the beginning of another. "Where am I?" John whispered, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness around him. The creature didn't move. It simply stared at him, its eyes unblinking. John closed his eyes, the weight of those words crushing him. He had no memory of the countless times he'd lived through this before, no recollection of the lives he'd witnessed fall apart. But deep inside, he knew it was true. This wasn't his first time. He had been here before, on this precipice, standing in the ruins of a world he couldn't save. "Why me?" John asked, his voice breaking. "Why choose me to witness all of this?" The air seemed to shift, and for the first time, the Mothman moved. It unfolded its wings and lifted into the air, gliding silently toward him. As it hovered above him, its eyes locked onto his, and John felt something pass between them, an understanding cold and infinite. Because someone must. And then, in an instant, the creature was gone, vanishing into the stormy sky, leaving John alone in the endless field, with only the knowledge of what was to come. The cycle had begun again. And John Klein, the eternal witness, would watch it all. Again and again. Forever. John remained on his knees in the barren field, the sky swelling with tempestuous clouds overhead. His body felt heavy, as if the knowledge of his fate was crushing him from the inside out. The Mothman was gone, its presence a fading echo in the air, but its words lingered, because someone must. The weight of those words settled deep into his bones. He had become a part of this cosmic, eternal cycle, a prisoner of fate's cruel repetition. There was no escape, no salvation, no purpose beyond witnessing the inevitable destruction over and over again. But as he sat there in the field, another thought began to creep into his mind. If this cycle was endless, if he had lived it countless times before, what if? What if there was something he hadn't yet realized? What if there was something he had overlooked in all these repetitions? With a surge of determination, John rose to his feet. The world around him felt unreal, like a dream that teetered on the edge of unraveling. The sky, the earth, the very air shimmered with an otherworldly haze, as if this place, this in-between realm, was nothing more than a fragment of his own mind. He had to find out if there was a way to break free. There had to be something. He took a step forward, and the ground beneath him shifted, rippling as though the fabric of reality was giving way. As he walked, the field transformed. The barren land twisted into something new, a familiar winding road, illuminated by the pale glow of his car's headlights. The night that had started it all. John's breath caught in his throat. He was back at the moment of his first encounter, reliving the night that had spiraled him into this endless nightmare. The scene was exactly the same. The dark, quiet road, the looming trees, and then, up ahead, the figure. The Mothman stood in the middle of the road, just as it had that first night, its red eyes glowing with the same cold, indifferent light. But this time, something was different. John didn't feel the same paralyzing fear. This time he felt something else, a clarity. He wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He understood now that he had been given these visions for a reason, even if that reason was twisted by cosmic cruelty. He had seen the end, over and over, but he had never tried to change what came after. He had accepted the role of the witness, but what if he could break it? What if he could stop the cycle? The thought consumed him. He could fight back. With a surge of adrenaline, John gunned the engine and sped toward the figure. The Mothman didn't move. It simply stared, its eyes glowing brighter as the car hurtled toward it. But John didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on the creature, willing himself not to blink, not to hesitate. If this was the moment it all began, maybe, just maybe, this was where he could end it. The car slammed into the figure, but there was no impact, no collision, no sound. Just nothing. The car passed through the Mothman as if it were nothing more than a shadow. A trick of the light. John slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the road, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned around, expecting to see the creature behind him. But the road was empty. The air was still, the night was quiet. And John was alone. For a long moment, he sat there in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. What had just happened? Had he missed his chance? Or was this all part of the loop, another step in the endless cycle? Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, not the Mothman, but a figure, standing at the edge of the trees. He squinted, trying to make it out in the darkness. It was Mary. John's heart lurched in his chest. He threw open the car door and stumbled out, his legs trembling as he ran toward her. She was standing still, her face calm, her eyes filled with a soft, knowing sadness. The closer John got, the more the world around him seemed to blur, the edges of reality fraying like an old, worn fabric. "Mary," he called, his voice cracking with desperation. "Mary, is it really you?" She didn't answer, but her expression was enough. She looked at him the way she had in those final days before her death, the same look of resigned understanding that had haunted him for so long. John stopped in his tracks, just a few feet away from her, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you?" Mary tilted her head slightly, her lips parting as if to speak, but the words never came. Instead, she lifted her hand, gesturing towards something behind him. John turned, his pulse quickening. And there, standing at the far end of the road, was the Mothman, its red eyes glowing brighter than ever before. But this time, something was different. The creature was no longer just watching. It was moving, slowly but deliberately, toward him. John turned back to Mary, but she was already fading, her form dissolving into the night like mist. His heart clenched with a mixture of sorrow and frustration. He had been so close to, what? Understanding? Escape? The Mothman loomed closer, its wings unfolding, casting long, ominous shadows across the road. But John didn't move. He stood his ground, staring into the creature's eyes, refusing to look away. And then something shifted. The ground beneath him trembled, the air around him thickening with an unseen force. The red glow of the Mothman's eyes intensified, filling John's vision until it was all he could see. The creature was no longer just a silent observer. It was speaking to him, not in words, but in feelings, in raw, overwhelming sensations. Time was folding in on itself again. John could feel it, the weight of countless lives, countless worlds collapsing in on this one moment. He was reliving the cycle, but this time there was no illusion of control. The Mothman wasn't just showing him the end. It was pulling him into it. John felt the ground give way beneath him, his body tumbling through the void, through the fabric of reality itself. The world around him shattered like glass, the pieces scattering into the dark, endless expanse. And all the while, those red eyes followed him, watching, waiting, drawing him deeper into the cycle. As the darkness closed in around him, John realized the terrible truth. He was never meant to stop the cycle. He was never meant to break free. He was always meant to become a part of it. The Mothman wasn't just an observer. It was a force, a manifestation of something far older, far more powerful than he could ever comprehend. And now, John was bound to it, caught in the eternal loop of destruction and rebirth, of witnessing and knowing. Forever. And as the last remnants of the world faded into the void, John's final thought was not of escape or salvation, but of the cold, unblinking eyes that had followed him through every moment, every vision. The Mothman watched. And now so would he. Forever. John's consciousness floated in the void, trapped in the endless darkness that stretched in every direction. Time ceased to have meaning. Seconds, minutes, hours, all were indistinguishable. He existed in the space between worlds, the void between cycles, a mere fragment of something larger, something unknowable. The Mothman's red eyes burned in the farthest corners of his awareness, always watching, always waiting. He could no longer feel his body, no longer sense the physical world, but he was still there, still aware. His mind twisted with the knowledge that this was it, the eternity that awaited him. There was no longer a question of escape, no illusion of breaking free from this nightmare. He was a part of it now, a piece of the cosmic mechanism that played out the end of worlds again and again. Then, without warning, the darkness rippled. John felt a sudden pull, like a great wave dragging him upward through the blackness. It wasn't gentle, but harsh, wrenching him from the void and thrusting him towards something new, or perhaps something old. The sensation of falling rushed back to him, his thoughts racing as he tried to brace himself for whatever came next. Light exploded around him, blinding, brilliant light. It burned at his senses, tearing through the black void, as if the fabric of existence itself was being torn apart. And then, with a jolt, he awoke. John was standing on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a city bathed in a twilight glow. The sky above him churned with dark clouds, and far below, The city seemed strangely still, as though it was waiting for something terrible to happen. The wind howled around him, biting at his skin, and for the first time in what felt like eons, John felt the weight of his body again, solid, real. He took a shaky breath, glancing around in confusion. Where was he? This wasn't Point Pleasant. This wasn't anywhere he recognized. But then he saw it. At the far edge of the cliff, perched on a jagged rock, the Mothman stood, its massive wings folded behind it, its red eyes glowing against the darkening sky. The creature stared at the city below, silent and unmoving, as if waiting for something to unfold. John's stomach twisted. This wasn't the end of a cycle. It was the beginning of a new one. He approached slowly, his legs heavy with dread. The closer he got to the Mothman, the more oppressive the air became. There was a weight here, something ancient and powerful that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The Mothman didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. It simply watched. John stopped a few feet away, his voice trembling. Is this another one? Another ending? The wind carried his words away, but the Mothman remained silent, its gaze fixed on the city below. John swallowed hard. He knew the answer. He didn't need the creature to speak it. He could feel it in his bones, in the very air around him. This was the start of another collapse, another tragedy waiting to unfold. And just like before, just like every time before, he was powerless to stop it. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath his feet. John's heart leaped into his throat as the cliffside began to shift. Rocks crumbled, tumbling down into the abyss below, and the city far below shuddered, as if in response to the tremors. He stumbled backward, watching in horror as the earth itself seemed to convulse. A low rumble echoed through the air, growing louder, more violent. The sky darkened further, the clouds swirling with unnatural speed. The city below began to move, the buildings swaying, the streets cracking. John's breath came in ragged gasps. He knew what was coming. The disaster. Just as in every other cycle, the collapse was inevitable. John turned back to the Mothman, desperation clawing at him. Why? Why shown if I can't stop it? Why keep me here just to watch? The Mothman's wings twitched, a subtle shift that sent a ripple through the air. For the first time, its glowing red eyes turned toward him, locking onto his with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Because you are part of the story, the voice echoed in his mind, cold and unfeeling. You are not here to stop. You are here to witness, to understand. John recoiled, shaking his head. Understand what? That everything ends. That no matter what I do, people will die. That I can't save anyone. The rumbling grew louder, and below, the first building collapsed in on itself, crumbling like dust. Screams echoed up from the city, distant and hollow, but John couldn't tear his eyes away from the creature in front of him. The Mothman's voice filled his mind once more. You were not chosen to save. You were chosen to see. To know that in every ending there is a beginning. This is the cycle. The words echoed in John's head, but they brought no comfort, no revelation. It was the same twisted truth he had been forced to accept over and over again. He was condemned to this fate, doomed to watch the collapse of worlds, trapped in an endless loop of destruction and rebirth. As the city below continued to fall apart, John felt a bitter anger welling up inside him. He had been chosen for this, bound to it by forces he could never hope to understand. But why? Why him? Why couldn't he just be free? His fists clenched, and he took a step closer to the Mothman, his voice rising above the chaos. What if I refuse? What if I refuse to watch? The Mothman's eyes flickered, and the creature unfurled its wings, towering over him. You cannot refuse what is inevitable. You are bound to this as I am. You will witness, and you will remember. The sky cracked open with a deafening roar, and the city below was consumed by a wall of fire. John's heart pounded in his chest as the flames rose higher, engulfing everything in their path. The screams were unbearable now, filling the air with a chorus of agony. And yet, despite the horror, despite the chaos, John couldn't look away. He was part of this. He had been chosen to watch, to know, to bear witness to the end, again and again, no matter how much he wanted to fight it. The cycle would never break. The Mothman turned back to the destruction below, its wings spread wide as if embracing the inevitable. And John, despite his anger, despite his sorrow, did the only thing he could. He watched, and as the world crumbled around him, as the fires consumed everything, John understood the terrible truth. The Mothman wasn't just a harbinger of doom. It was a reflection of something far deeper, far older than the end of a single world. It was the eternal witness to the cycle of life and death, the end and the beginning. And now, so was he. Forever. The world burned. John stood on the edge of the crumbling cliff, his gaze locked on the chaos below as flames tore through the city, swallowing everything in their path. The ground shuddered beneath him, threatening to collapse, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The Mothman's presence weighed heavily on his mind, its dark wings stretched wide as it loomed over the destruction like an ancient sentinel. The screams, the smoke, the relentless roar of the world unraveling, it was all too familiar. But there was no fear in John now, only a deep, hollow acceptance. The Mothman had spoken the truth. He wasn't here to stop anything. He was here to witness, to be a part of the cycle, to watch everything fall apart only to be rebuilt again. This was his curse, his burden. But deep inside him, something still rebelled against it. There had to be more. There had to be something beyond this endless loop of endings. As the last of the city disappeared beneath a wave of flame and rubble, John's thoughts turned inward to the countless cycles he had endured, each one more terrible than the last. The faces of the people he had seen, the lives lost, the destruction he could never prevent. It all bled together like fragments of a forgotten dream. He had watched it all so many times that he had lost count, each world collapsing into another, each disaster leading to the next. But now, as he stood beside the Mothman on this cliff of oblivion, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. Something the creature wasn't telling him. The cycle wasn't just about destruction. The Mothman had said there was a beginning in every end, but what was that beginning? What came after the collapse? What was he not seeing? John turned to the Mothman, its glowing red eyes fixed on the smoldering ruins below. He felt the same cold detachment radiating from it, the same indifferent power that had been with him since the first night he saw it. "Why me?" John asked, his voice a whisper carried away by the wind. "Why am I the one who has to watch all of this?" The Mothman didn't move, didn't respond at first. The air around them grew heavier, the sky darkening further as if the universe itself was holding its breath. And then, finally, the creature spoke, its voice echoing in John's mind like the tolling of a distant bell. "Because you are the witness, and the witness must always remember." John's frustration surged, and he stepped forward, closer to the creature, daring to meet its gaze. "Remember what? Every time it ends, it begins again. But what am I supposed to understand from this? What's the point of seeing it all fall apart if I can never change it?" The Mothman turned its eyes toward him, the glowing red orbs boring into his soul. "You misunderstand. It is not about change. It is about understanding the cycle." John's breath hitched. The cycle. He had heard those words before, over and over, but they had always sounded like a cruel joke, a meaningless trap designed to keep him locked in this nightmare. But now, standing in the ashes of yet another ruined world, the words took on a new meaning. "What happens after the end?" John asked, his voice shaking. "You've shown me the destruction, the collapse, the suffering. But what comes next? What's beyond this?" The Mothman's wings shifted, the massive dark appendages stretching out farther as the ground trembled beneath them. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if considering John's question for the first time. "After the end, there is silence." John's heart sank. Silence. An empty, hollow word that held no answers, no revelations. He had been hoping for something more, some grand explanation, some hidden truth that would make sense of all the suffering, all the destruction. But there was nothing, just silence. "No," John said, his voice firmer now, stronger. "There's more than that. You wouldn't be here if there wasn't more. You wouldn't show me all of this if there wasn't something to find. There has to be something after the silence." The Mothman's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, John felt a shift in the creature's presence. It wasn't anger or frustration, but something deeper, something darker. The creature's wings folded in slowly, its gaze never leaving John. The silence is the space between. John's mind raced, the words echoing in his thoughts. The space between. Was that where he was now? This strange, liminal realm where he stood on the edge of destruction, always just outside the reach of the collapse. The silence wasn't the end. It was the void between endings, the place where everything paused before it began again. "And what if I don't want to be part of it anymore?" John asked, his voice rising with a mix of defiance and desperation. "What if I want out? What if I don't want to witness this anymore?" The Mothman's gaze grew colder, more distant. "You cannot escape the cycle. You are bound to it as I am. To witness is to understand the nature of existence." John shook his head, backing away from the creature. "No, I won't accept that. There has to be a way out. There has to be a way to end this, to break the cycle for good." The Mothman didn't move, its eyes glowing brighter now, a deep crimson light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the earth itself. "The cycle is eternal. It cannot be broken. To try is to deny the very fabric of what is." John felt the ground shift beneath his feet, the tremors growing stronger as the last remnants of the city below crumbled into nothingness. The air crackled with energy, the sky splitting open with a blinding flash of light. He could feel the end coming again, the inevitable collapse that would reset everything. But this time, something inside him resisted. He wouldn't let it happen. Not again, not without a fight. "I don't care," John said through gritted teeth, his fists clenched. "I won't keep watching. I'll find a way out, no matter what it takes." The Mothman's wings unfurled once more, casting a dark shadow over the cliff. Its voice boomed in John's mind, louder, more powerful than ever before. "Then you will be consumed by it. The end will claim you as it claims all things." John took one last look at the creature, its towering form silhouetted against the stormy sky, and then, with a burst of defiance, he turned and ran. He ran toward the edge of the cliff, toward the abyss, toward the unknown. He didn't know where he was going, or what waited for him on the other side, but he couldn't stay here. He couldn't be trapped in this cycle forever. Behind him, the world began to tear apart, the cliff crumbling, the sky collapsing into itself. The Mothman's presence loomed larger and larger, its red eyes burning into his back, but John kept running, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind focused on one singular thought: escape. As he reached the edge of the cliff, the ground gave way beneath him, and for a moment he was weightless, falling into the void. The wind roared in his ears, the world spinning around him as he plunged deeper into the darkness. But this time he wasn't afraid, because this time he chose to fall. And in that final fleeting moment, as the void swallowed him whole, John understood what the Mothman had been trying to show him all along. The cycle couldn't be broken, but maybe, just maybe, it could be escaped. As the darkness closed in, he reached for that thought, clinging to it like a lifeline as the silence finally took him. And somewhere, in the farthest reaches of the void, the Mothman watched, its red eyes glowing in the eternal night. But this time, it watched with something new in its gaze: curiosity. John plunged into the void, his body weightless, his mind spinning as the abyss swallowed him. The sensation of falling stretched on endlessly, but this time it was different. He had made a choice not to remain in the eternal loop, to fight back against the cycle. And for the first time, as he fell through the emptiness, he felt something that had been absent for so long: hope. The void was thick with darkness, a suffocating emptiness that pressed in on all sides. But somewhere deep within, John knew that this was the space between, the place where time and existence unraveled, where the cycle reset itself. He had been here before, in different forms, in different moments, always swept along by the current of fate. But now he was falling through it with intention. He wasn't waiting to be pulled into the next disaster, to be thrust back into another world destined for collapse. He had chosen to fall, chosen to find a way out. The darkness around him rippled, strange flashes of light flickering in the corners of his vision, like distant stars winking out in the far reaches of space. His body felt numb, like he was drifting in a cold, endless sea. But his mind remained sharp, focused on one question: could he escape the cycle? Time stretched on, or perhaps it didn't exist at all here. John wasn't sure. He had no sense of how long he had been falling, but eventually something shifted. The weightless sensation began to change, and he could feel gravity pulling at him again. The darkness was thinning, giving way to something brighter, more tangible. The void around him churned, as though resisting his presence, but he kept falling, deeper and deeper, until light. Blinding, brilliant light burst around him, and John slammed into solid ground, the impact jarring him back into his body. He gasped, sucking in air, his chest heaving as he struggled to regain his bearings. The light was too bright, overwhelming his senses, and he raised a hand to shield his eyes. Slowly, the light dimmed and John blinked, his vision adjusting to his surroundings. He was no longer in the void, no longer in that in-between place of endless nothingness. Instead, he found himself standing in an open field, surrounded by tall, swaying grass that glowed with an ethereal light. The sky above was a deep shade of blue, dotted with soft, shimmering stars. A gentle breeze brushed against his skin, and the air smelled sweet, like rain on fresh earth. John's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It felt real, more real than anything he had experienced in the endless loops of destruction, but there was something strange about this place, something otherworldly. He took a hesitant step forward, his feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. The ground felt solid beneath him, but there was an energy in the air, a hum of life that vibrated through his bones. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before. Where am I?" John whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness. There was no answer, but the world around him seemed to pulse in response, as though it were alive, as though it were aware of his presence. He looked up at the sky, half expecting to see the Mothman's glowing red eyes staring down at him, but there was nothing, just the stars twinkling softly above. For a moment, John allowed himself to hope that he had escaped, that he had broken free from the cycle and found his way into something new, something untouched by the endless repetition of endings. But deep down, he knew it couldn't be that simple. And then, as if in answer to his thoughts, the air around him grew colder. John froze. The grass at his feet rustled as the wind picked up, and the once gentle breeze became sharp, biting. The sky darkened, the stars dimming, and a shadow passed over the land. His heart sank as he turned, knowing what he would see. On the horizon, silhouetted against the fading light, stood the Mothman. Its wings were spread wide, its towering form casting a long shadow across the field. The red glow of its eyes cut through the darkness, piercing and cold, locking onto John from a distance. John's breath hitched and his mind raced. How had it followed him? How was it here, in this place that felt so far removed from the cycles of destruction? He had fallen into the void, escaped the loop, so why was the Mothman still here? The creature remained still, its wings barely shifting in the wind, its gaze fixed on John as if waiting, as if watching to see what he would do next. A surge of anger rose in John's chest. He had fought so hard to break free, to escape the endless torment of witnessing the end over and over again. He had thrown himself into the abyss, risking everything to find a way out, and yet here it was, the same unfeeling, unmoving harbinger of doom. "No," John whispered, shaking his head. "Not again." The Mothman didn't move, didn't react. Its presence alone was enough to suffocate the hope that had briefly flared in John's chest. He could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on him, the same oppressive force that had haunted him for what felt like lifetimes. But something inside him refused to surrender. John clenched his fists, his teeth grinding together. "You won't take this from me," he muttered, his voice growing louder, stronger. "I won't go back." The wind howled around him, the sky darkening further as the Mothman's presence seemed to grow. The creature's eyes burned brighter, their crimson glow reflecting off the grass at John's feet. The field, once calm and serene, was now a battleground, the air charged with tension, with the unspoken knowledge that this was a pivotal moment. John took a step forward, his jaw set with determination. "I've seen enough. I've watched the end over and over. I'm done with it." For the first time, the Mothman moved. Its wings shifted, a slow, deliberate motion, and the ground beneath John trembled. The creature's eyes flickered, the light within them pulsing like a heartbeat. "You cannot escape what you are," the voice echoed in John's mind, filling him with a cold certainty. The Mothman's gaze bore into him, its presence overwhelming, like the weight of the universe itself. But this time, John refused to back down. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not just a witness, not anymore." The Mothman's eyes flared, and the world around them seemed to shudder in response. The sky cracked with lightning, and the ground rippled beneath John's feet, but he stood firm, staring the creature down. "You showed me the end, over and over, but now I know the cycle only repeats because we let it." The Mothman tilted its head slightly, as if considering John's words. The wind howled louder, the darkness pressing in, but John didn't falter. He had made his choice. "I'm not letting it happen again," John said, his voice rising above the storm. "I'm not going to stand by and watch anymore. I'm going to change it." The Mothman's wings unfurled, a massive shadowy expanse that blotted out the sky. Its red eyes blazed with intensity, and the air crackled with power. John felt the ground tremble beneath him, the weight of the creature's presence almost unbearable. But in that moment, as the storm raged around them, John realized something. The Mothman wasn't just a harbinger of destruction. It was a test. It was the force that revealed the end, but it was also the force that offered the possibility of change for those who dared to defy it. With a final surge of resolve, John took another step forward, staring into the Mothman's burning eyes. "I'm not afraid anymore." And in that instant, something shifted. The world trembled, the sky split with blinding light, and John felt the ground give way beneath him once more. But this time, it wasn't a fall into darkness. It was a leap into the unknown. The cycle was breaking, and John was ready to face whatever came next.